Welcome back to 52 Moments, where I answer things like,
Why are you like this?
or,
What happened to you?
or even,
Who did you piss off?
as best I can. Along the way, I hope you'll learn more about me. So let's get to it. Hey, welcome back. This episode is called Union Thug. Um, Most people who know me know that I do a lot of work for the union. I'm a union activist. Union Thug is just kind of one of those things that came out in the 80s. Lots of people had little buttons that stated Union Thug. And it was just kind of like reclaiming what management called union activists. um, for the most part, our local isn't combative or anything. I've I've been with the same university local since 1988, and I've been active since the 90s, like mid to late 90s. And I wanted to talk a bit about how I got into it because I get asked this all the time. And you will find a very common thread of how people get involved in their union local is because they benefited pretty directly from something. And for me, I had taken a position that was contract funded. And at the time that I took this, um, I essentially quit UVic. Like I ended up taking because it was contract funded, I had to leave my position, which meant that I lost my um, previous uh, years of service, all of that stuff. I still benefited from the pay levels within the contract, but there was a lot of our collective agreement that no longer applied to me. And that was fine as long as the contract kept getting renewed. But at some point, the contract was canceled, and we happened to be in bargaining at that time. And it was just one of those weird planets aligning moments where um, they managed to sign the contract days before my position ended. Like I'd been given my 2 weeks notice, and somewhere in the middle of that second week, we signed the contract, which brought contract paid employees back into the bargaining unit fully, which meant that I then had all the capacity to apply as an internal and do bumping if I needed to and all of that stuff. The union really went to bat for me, found me another temporary position because I really didn't want to bump anyone out of their position. It's messy, and even though the rights are there, it's not something that anyone ever really wants to do. So we found a temporary position where someone was leaving on mat leave. I had to go through a lot of hoops to prove that I could do the work because it wasn't library work, it was secretarial work. I know. Um, so proved I could do the work, got hired, did that. And then I was able to go into another library job after that. It just worked out. And I took the job I went back to was was a step or two down from the job I had been doing. But at the time I was happier to do that and know that I could have mobility still within the university, and knowing that I had a full-time permanent job. That was more critical to me than anything else. So basically, union went to bat for me, and once I got settled in the new position, I said, hey, how can I help the union? And I started out doing health and safety committee work, which meant that I sat on what's called a joint committee, which is half management, half union. And if there was any kind of workplace incident, accident, whatever you want to call it, we went and did an investigation. That was the first step before anyone decided whether they were going to contact WCB or any of that. Everything gets filed with WCB, which is Workers' Compensation Board, which actually is now called WorkSafe BC. It's essentially the employer's insurance. And that's an important thing for workers to remember, that it's there to benefit the employer. So they don't like paying employees, which means that some of the first training that I did was learning how to argue with WCB and all of the forms that needed to be filled out and all of the gotchas to watch for, and the many ways that employees kind of doom themselves by saying things like, oh, I'm not hurting that bad, when they haven't got the opinion of a medical person, whether that's their GP or whether that's a specialist. Anyway, I digress. Because I was doing workplace investigations, I was also trained as a steward at that time. A steward is a person who helps make sure that people are getting what they are owed through the collective agreement. And the collective agreement, for those who don't know, is the sort of set of guidelines and understandings that is signed between the union and the employer, that sort of sets out everything. It sets out our wages, it sets out what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, how much vacation we get, all of that stuff. And it's negotiated every few years. And that can range between 2 and 5 years. I think we once had a 7-year contract, which was ridiculous, but I think that was right around either the Commonwealth Games or the Olympics. It was a big deal, and the government didn't want to be dealing with anyone for a while. So we had a long contract. So from stewarding, I went into other committee work. I eventually ended up on the communications committee, helping with the newsletter and that sort of thing. And then I was like, hey, I think we could use a new website. So I got tasked with building the website. I ended up becoming communications chair when the union built that position, because it didn't exist before. Well, it existed as part of the committee structure, but not on the executive board. So I've bounced on and off of the executive board. I've done all sorts of work in various different capacities. I was member at large for a while. I'm currently a trustee, which means that you get to check and make sure that all the financials are in order once a year and file that with the national union. It's lots of fun. I've been to lots of conventions. I absolutely adore going to conventions. I love standing up and talking in favor of things, or sometimes against things if they don't make any sense. Union activism is something that allows me to give back when I've gained so much. And currently, a big focus for me, I sit on a couple of larger, sort of outside of the university bodies, committees, the QPBC Pink Triangle and the BC Federation of Labor 2S LGBTQIA plus committees, and those do bigger work across the province, advocating for various queer rights. And there are similar committees for education, for libraries, for people with disabilities, for persons of color, etc. Like there's a lot of these sort of working groups. International Solidarity is another one. So they may work with like coffee farmers in Nicaragua or something. There's a lot of work that unions do. And unions exist on a lot of different levels, just like we have municipal governments and provincial and federal. We have a national union. We have the provincial arm of that union. We also have these larger umbrellas of House of Labour, so the Canadian Federation of Labour and then the BC Federation. And locally, we also have the Victoria Labour Council, which is the equivalent of those other umbrellas, which allows me to interact with people from other unions, whether that is like IATSE, who do a lot of lighting and tech and sound for the film industry or theaters, whether that is Unifor, who run BC Transit, BC Teachers Federation, like all of these different unions all mix and mingle in some of those meetings and conventions. And I find it fascinating to see which issues are sort of mutually shared and which are just kind of our problem. And we can get help with things that are, even if they're just our problem, we can reach out for help from these other locals, from these other levels of unions. And it's just, the bottom line is we're there to serve the workers. And that's even people who are not in unions. One of the big things that we have is the Retail Action Network, which is a group of people who go around and talk to people who work, especially in low wage, entry level retail jobs, who may not know what their rights are, just their basic worker rights. And we can help them through that, help them get paid when they're not getting paid for overtime, all that kind of stuff. Union activism, being a union thug, is something that means a lot for me. And I often get more flack for being in a union than for being out as queer. Like, it's just, both of them are things that I have to kind of come out as, because a lot of people just kind of hate unions on principle, because there's a lot of propaganda out there. The conservatives tend to hate unions because they allege that we take away employer rights, which we don't. We still give employers the right to manage and all that good stuff. Yeah, so like half of my life I've been active in unions, and most of my jobs have been union jobs. I have worked outside of unions and I don't like it. I much prefer the benefits and the protections that I am granted through a collective agreement, and I really wish everybody had access to a union. And that's kind of what I fight for most of the time in my spare time. All of this is volunteer. I can do some of it on work time, but not all of it. I will be giving up like a Saturday in September, simply to go to a meeting. But, it's all worth it in the end. And yeah, now you know another thing about me. This is a very long and rambly one. I hope you'll come back again for a less rambly one next time. Thanks.